Hi everyone, and welcome to Alopecia's Audacity podcast, proudly hosted by the Canadian Alopecia Areata Foundation. I'm Sarah Teskey.
I'm Crystal Malcolm.
And I'm Lauren Harrison. We're here to offer you a breath of fresh air from those without hair.
Now listen, alopecia isn't easy, but we're going to challenge its audacity through our candid conversations, letting hair loss know that it cannot stop us from living our best life. We're here to empower, educate, and inspire you so that you leave us feeling confident knowing that you can be bald, bold, and free, not only on your own, but when you're surrounded by others.
On behalf of Canadians who have been diagnosed with alopecia areata, CANAAF promotes awareness, education, raises funds for research, and so much more for those affected by this autoimmune disease.
You can find CANAAF on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn at CANAAF. That is CANAAF, and learn more about our organization at canaaf.org. On our homepage, you can subscribe to receive our monthly emails, and we'll send you updates on our latest episodes as well as other alopecia news and event updates. Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Today we're talking about what's new in treatment and research for anyone with alopecia areata, as well as sorting through some of the facts as to what causes alopecia areata. This is a topic so many people want to know about, and most of the questions that we get at CANAAF are treatment related. So that's why today we've invited our good friend and alopecia expert, Anthony Gilding, to talk to us about this topic and answer some of the questions you listeners have sent in. So a little bit about Anthony. Anthony Gilding is CANAAF's Director of Science and Research. Born and raised in Toronto, Ontario, Anthony has had alopecia areata since he was 14 years old. Anthony is an aspiring dermatologist and autoimmune disease epidemiologist. He is passionate about educating Canadians on alopecia areata while conducting research in the field to influence the medical and psychosocial care that is provided to patients living with this condition. Currently, he holds an Honours Bachelor of Science with distinction in Biomedical Sciences from Toronto Metropolitan University, and he is an up-and-coming scientific author and researcher. Anthony's research has been published in the Journal of Medical Internet Research Dermatology, the Canadian Journal for Nurse Practitioners, and most recently the prestigious journal Autoimmunity Reviews. His research has also been presented at the Canadian Dermatology Association conference back in the summer of 2022. Wow, what an incredible bio, Anthony. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today.
Yeah, so we've got a lot of great questions today, so we're really excited to get into it. But before that, Anthony, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your story with alopecia areata?
Yeah, so my story, there's really two parts to it. So when I was 7 years old, I developed a couple, I think it was like 2 or 3 bald spots on the side of my head. And so this was back in 2006, 2007, when we knew even less about alopecia areata than we know now. And so my family physician treated it with steroid creams. I didn't see a dermatologist or anything like that. And the hair came back, and I didn't have to think about it for about 7 years. And then in 2013, when I was 14 years old, it came back the same way. I was getting a haircut, and my dad, who was a barber, noticed a bald spot on the side of my head. And at first we thought maybe he just cut the hair too short, but then we looked closely and realized there was no hair there at all. So there was no way that he did that. Saw my family physician. She confirmed it's alopecia areata. So I thought, okay, it's going to be the same thing. We'll use the steroid cream and the hair will come back. But this time it didn't. And that one spot got bigger and bigger. And then I noticed another spot and another spot. And eventually it looked like somebody had taken a pencil eraser and erased a bunch of circles in my head. It was that drastic. And then it kind of progressed. to what we call alopecia universalis, which is where you have no hair on your head, eyebrows, eyelashes are gone, no body hair. And I've had that for about, since 2014, 2015, however many years that is. Don't ask me to do the math. And it's kind of waxed and waned. So I've had some hair grow back, some fall out. It's been a cyclical journey. And yeah, that's kind of my alopecia journey up until now.
So what kind of emotional impact did that have? Because if you had it so like in your preteen years, and kids can be such a ray of sunshine in school.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, like, how did that impact your emotional and mental state going through it during junior high school versus transitioning into high school? How did that?
Yeah, it was incredibly tough for me, not only just the alopecia itself, but I was also coming to terms with my own sexuality and coming to terms with the fact that I was gay. And so having this happen at the same time was like, what is going on? Like, I don't even know what to do. But the alopecia was incredibly challenging. I had very significant anxiety and depression because of it. I actually had to finish my high school diploma from home because it was just so, mentally overbearing that I didn't have the strength to go to school and to face all of my peers. But yeah, I almost don't even really have the words to articulate just how difficult it was, not only for me, but for my family, while they were kind of watching helplessly. Yeah, so it was very, very difficult.
What kind of supports did you have that helped you get through it?
Well, I had my family, which I think I wouldn't be here today without them. So they were crucial. They were my number one support system. I also had my friends and the support of mental health professionals and my family physician was really, really important for me because I think initially I was in denial. I couldn't accept that I had alopecia. I was convinced that my hair was going to grow back. And so I was kind of resistant to receiving mental health support because everyone was telling me, you have to accept that you might not get your hair back. So let's work on your mental health. I didn't want to hear that because as far as I was concerned, my hair was coming back.
Yeah.
But when I kind of came to the realization that that might not happen, then I opened up and I spoke to my family and my family physician who connected me with a psychiatrist. And so really that whole network of people was the village that I needed to get to where I am today.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that with us, Anthony. It really is meaningful to have that vulnerability, and it is probably helpful for some of our listeners to hear that denial and slowly coming to acceptance can be a part of the journey, that all in good time we come to terms with what accepting our alopecia means.
So Anthony, you had mentioned that you did suffer from depression and anxiety, and that caused you to have to be homeschooled. What was that experience like? Did you feel like you were missing out more and kind of like maybe robbing yourself of having that interaction with peers and networking and connecting with other students and that sort of thing because you were in such a hard state? Like, how did you manage that?
There was a lot of resistance from my school as well as my parents and even my dermatologist at the time. They were all saying, we would really prefer that you be in school if you can. But for me, I was going to school with the alopecia. I was trying, but I unfortunately did experience bullying, and I didn't have the mental strength to deal with that while also dealing with my alopecia. So I just had a very candid conversation with my parents, and I said, listen, I need to take some time to myself. I want to finish my diploma. I want to finish school, but I need to do it somewhere where I feel safe and comfortable because what was happening was I was starting to fail and academically, and that had never happened. Up until that point, I had always been a straight A plus student, and science and math were always my strong suits, and I was starting to fail in those classes. And so that was the sign that I needed to take some time. So initially, when I started the homeschooling, I didn't feel like I was missing out on anything because I was really only focused on my alopecia and my mental health. So I wasn't really thinking about anything else. But as time went on, I did start to feel a bit left out because, I would see people posting on social media that they were going to parties and all of these school gatherings, and I wasn't really talking to anybody from my school. So I did feel quite left out, but in retrospect, it probably was the best decision that I could have ever made because the homeschooling allowed me to get the mental health care that I needed. And so I don't regret it.
And so you didn't end up finding CANAAF until a few years ago, right? Did you happen to meet anyone else with alopecia when you were younger, or anyone else that you could relate to before you found CANAAF?
No. So it was an incredibly isolating experience for me because as far as I could tell, I was the only person that I knew of that had alopecia. None of my dermatologists or family physician at the time knew about CANAAF. Nobody knew where I could go for support. And it wasn't until I was in university and doing my own research that I came across CANAAF. So for those many years up until that point, I felt very alone, and finding CANAAF was like a breath of fresh air. It was just what I needed.
I know how how it can be very difficult experience to go through, and a difficult one to talk about too. Thank you for being vulnerable here with us today.
Of course.
Absolutely. And I just had a quick question. Now, when you were in school, like I know some of our female listeners, like when they started to experience hair loss, one of the things that they would do is maybe wear a wig or a scarf or a beanie or something. Did you have any options at all? Like, did you try maybe a toupee, or were you able, because I know in some schools you're not allowed to wear hats. So I'm just curious, were you able to wear a hat or put a bandana on to maybe cover up certain areas? Like, how did you navigate through that as well before transitioning off into homeschool?
Yeah, so my high school had a very strict dress code, and hats were not allowed. But when I spoke to my school with my parents about my alopecia, they offered to allow me to wear a hat. But I chose not to because knowing that the dress code was so strict, if I was the only one wearing a hat, it would inevitably draw more attention to me than I think the alopecia would, because everyone would be saying, why is Anthony wearing a hat? Why is Anthony allowed to wear a hat, but we can't? What is he hiding? And I just didn't want to deal with that. And I also didn't want to deal with the possibility that somebody rips my hat off and everybody sees it. And so what I did was, so as I mentioned earlier, my dad is a barber and a hairstylist. And at the time, I did have some hair left still. So he tried his best to work with it and camouflage the spots as best as we could. And so that's what I was doing for as long as I could until the spots got so big that I couldn't cover it anymore. And at that point, I was only at school for maybe a couple of weeks before I made the decision to transition into homeschooling. Okay.
And did you seek any medical treatment at that young age by chance?
Yeah, I did. So I had a dermatologist, but they weren't the most enthusiastic about treating it. Their belief was that this is just hair and that many of their patients were living with alopecia and it didn't bother them, so it shouldn't bother me either.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was difficult for me to deal with. But they did offer me some things. So they offered me a stronger corticosteroid lotion. And I did that for, gosh, probably about a year with no success. And at that point, they didn't really have much more to offer me. But I wasn't satisfied with that. So I sought care from another dermatologist. And this one was much, much better. And I really attribute the dermatologist that I'm going to be to her, because she not only was concerned about treating my alopecia, but she was treating me just as a human being. And she always wanted to make sure that every step of the way that my mental health was in check and that I was being taken care of in that respect. So I'm very grateful for her.
That's awesome. And, in speaking about treatments, that kind of leads me into talking about treatments and research. And, I really want you to help us debunk some of the facts versus fiction that's surrounding the causes of alopecia, because as you know, the internet can be full of a lot of misinformation causing, some confusion and uncertainty, especially for people who are newly diagnosed or even for us who have been living with it for quite some time. So having said that, I want us to play a little game. Are you up for it?
I'm ready.
Okay. So the game is called Fact or Myth. So basically myself, Sarah, and Lauren, we're going to ask you a question and you're going to answer either fact or myth, and then you're going to explain what it means. Okay?
Okay.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
You ready, Anthony?
All right. Drum roll, please. Okay. So first question, alopecia areata is caused by stress.
I would say partly myth, partly fact. So stress itself doesn't necessarily cause alopecia from a biological standpoint, but we do know that chronic stress can exacerbate it or make it worse. So my short answer would be that stress does not cause alopecia areata, but for some people it can make it worse.
Okay. Well, our second is alopecia areata is contagious.
Absolute myth. So alopecia areata is not contagious. It's not an infection. It's an autoimmune disease. So you absolutely cannot get it just by being in contact with somebody.
Okay. That's a great one to know, especially for kids. Sometimes children don't understand why other children may have hair loss or alopecia. So there can be some myths out there surrounding whether it's contagious or not. So that's a great one to debunk.
Are the causes of alopecia areata and scarring alopecia areata the same?
So it's not the easiest question to answer, and that's because we know very little about scarring alopecia, and it really depends on the type of scarring alopecia that we're talking about. But I can say very generally that we know a little bit more about alopecia areata than we do about scarring alopecia. And from what we do know, they're probably not the same biologically speaking, like in terms of how the diseases work, but there may well also be some similarities. And that's something that I want to explore in my own career, is trying to delineate what exactly is going on, not only in alopecia areata, because we still have more to learn about that, but scarring alopecia as well, because so little is known about that.
Absolutely. Alopecia areata is hereditary.
So it's a fact for some people, but not for everyone. So
okay,
we haven't fully elucidated the genetic behavior of alopecia areata. So we know that in some families it's generational, and every generation has alopecia areata, whereas some families, like myself, there's only one person on both sides of the family who has it. So yeah, for some people it is hereditary and others it isn't. And again, it just speaks to this idea that there's so much that we don't know about alopecia areata that we just can't tell you if it's going to run in your family or not.
Right. That's really interesting to know that it can be different for other people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, our last one is alopecia areata can be caused by other autoimmune diseases?
I would say myth, because it's not that alopecia areata is caused by other autoimmune diseases, but when somebody has an autoimmune disease, whether it's alopecia areata or rheumatoid arthritis or systemic lupus, if you have one, you're more likely to have another one. But it's not that they cause each other. It's just that you have this predisposition to having more than one autoimmune disease if you already have one. So no, as far as I know, alopecia areata is not caused by other autoimmune diseases, but it's quite common to see people with alopecia areata who have other autoimmune diseases such as vitiligo or type 1 diabetes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Is there anything else that you would like to debunk or, add on to about causes of alopecia areata?
I don't know that I have anything to debunk with respect to causes, but the biggest myth that I would like to debunk is that alopecia areata is just a cosmetic condition, because it's not. While it is true that alopecia areata doesn't necessarily affect our health, and people generally are very healthy with alopecia areata, it has a very significant impact on people's mental health, and their social health. And so it very much is a legitimate medical condition that has very serious ramifications.
I've always wondered why people think that it's just hair. Because like you said, it's so much, it goes beyond that. And I wish people could just see that, because I know that there are people out there that probably wouldn't want to trade places with us, but they're the same ones that would say, oh, it's just hair. You'll be fine. You're still a beautiful person. Nothing's changed. But I think people forget that we're actually mourning a loss, and it's a new look for us. Like, we have to learn how to re-love ourselves and re-like what we see in the mirror. And for some of us, it's so traumatic. Like, you're losing a part of your culture and identity. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think, it's very easy for people on the outside to look at it and say, oh, it's just hair, nothing's changed. But what people don't really understand is that we associate so much of our identity with how we look.
Exactly.
Because when we wake up in the morning, that's what we see in the mirror. That person, that's who we are to us. And so when your physical identity is changing, often so rapidly, and you really feel like you're losing your whole identity, and you kind of have to find who you are again. And so it's always frustrated me when people, even with the best of intentions, when they're saying it's just hair and, you're no different, you're not really helping. You're probably making it worse when you say that. And so I just always implore people to be empathetic and not be so quick to jump on the it's just hair bandwagon.
That's so true. Thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think that's probably, like you said, the biggest myth that we have to really work to debunk. And that's a big part of what CANAAF tries to do, is just to really educate and bring awareness to the internal battle that we go through when we lose our hair.
So for those who are experiencing signs of hair loss, Anthony, what can they do in the interim, maybe while they're waiting for an appointment with a dermatologist?
So the first thing that I would recommend they do is get in contact with their family physician or nurse practitioner, because they are going to be the ones to make the referral to see a dermatologist. And in the interim, they actually can prescribe not many treatments, but there are some things that they can prescribe. So they can prescribe corticosteroid lotions, which you can start. They don't work for everyone, but they do work for some people. And so it doesn't hurt to give it a try. And I would also, not even just from a treatment perspective, but while you're waiting to see a dermatologist, I would strongly recommend that they start seeking mental health care, even if they think they're okay right now. I think it's important to kind of get the ball rolling in that, because if the alopecia gets worse, that tends to be when people start to experience things like anxiety and depression. And so if we can be proactive about that and get on top of that by seeking that mental health support before things get worse, I think that people would be in a better position to cope if and when that situation arises.
That's excellent advice. Yeah, it's helpful, like you said, to do things almost proactively, and that preparation really is key, maybe for something that, like you spoke about earlier, is oftentimes a very rapid loss or such a cyclical and unpredictable pattern of loss. So thank you for that insight.
Of course.
Yeah, I always found when I went to dermatology appointments, even when I'd been more than once, I always found it was helpful for me to even do some research ahead of time and really be as informed as possible before going in. And then even just writing some questions down ahead of time or bringing them with me, just so I'm there and I'm ready to ask what I need to ask. Because sometimes in the moment you can feel a little nervous or a little anxious. You may forget things. So I always found that helped me too. I don't know what you guys think, or if there's any other things that helped you going into appointments.
I think for me, the one thing that I do regret about my alopecia journey was not taking pictures. I was not in the mental state to want to have something tangible in my hand where it was like, oh, look at my scalp's bleeding on Monday. That's awesome. I just didn't want to have something that I could refer to. But I really wish in hindsight that I did take photos, because when I did see a dermatologist, they were just basing their assessment off of what they could see right then and there. Do you know what I mean? So I feel like if they had a history of photos, then they could see the different types of experiences that I had, because I have a form of scarring alopecia, and it's CCCA. Anthony, do you want to say it? Because I always mess up the way I say it.
So it's central centrifugal cicatricial alopecia.
Yes. Oh, that's a great point.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. It's just maybe having somebody else take those pictures for you, because I can say from my experience, the few times that I did take pictures of my scalp, it was incredibly traumatic to see the full extent of what it looked like. Because I could only see the top and the sides of my head. I couldn't see the back of my head. And I almost didn't want to see it because I didn't want to accept how bad it was. But I do agree that taking pictures helps the dermatologist or the practitioner kind of have an idea of, this is what it looked like at this point, this is what it looks like now.
Right.
But it might be helpful to have someone else take them. And you don't even have to look at them. Just have them. And maybe just give them to your dermatologist and say, here, this is what it looked like. And you don't have to look at it if you don't want to, because I know for me, it elicited very strong emotional responses when I saw just how extensive the hair loss was for me.
Yeah, because there's no rhyme or reason to it. Alopecia just kind of strikes out of nowhere. And it's what's happening to my body? Is it something that I ate? Is it something, maybe I drank something or I had an allergic reaction? We just don't know, right? So you're absolutely right. Having someone else take photos is probably an excellent idea, because I know for me, it was very triggering.
Yeah, absolutely. That can be very shocking to see for the first time and for the second time and for, a while after that too.
For sure.
Anthony, you already mentioned a few treatments that are available for alopecia areata. Can you talk to us more about what options are out there for both adults and for children? Because I know some are safe for adults, but some aren't safe for children. What are our options?
Yeah, absolutely. So the unfortunate reality is that all of the treatment options that I will go over were never really meant for alopecia areata. It just kind of happened that we realized it worked for some people. So they're all repurposed treatments, but kind of starting from the beginning, corticosteroid lotions, they are often the first line therapy. These are medications that you would apply to the scalp or very carefully to the eyebrows. And the hope is that the medication will be absorbed into the skin and trigger the skin to produce anti-inflammatory proteins. If that doesn't work, then the next line would be corticosteroid injections. So injecting the steroid directly into the skin. And you can do that for the scalp as well as for the eyebrows. I did also hear that in the US they were doing that for eyelashes, but I would not recommend that because I certainly don't want a needle in my eyelid.
No.
For some people did that and it worked for them, and that's great.
Wow.
So we have that. And then the corticosteroid injections tend to work quite well for people, but the issue with that is that it's not long lasting. So you will likely get some hair regrowth with the injections, but you have to consistently go for these injections to keep the hair growth there. And so many people will do it for however many months until they get tired of going, and then they kind of just stop. And then in those cases, if we wanted to be a little bit more aggressive with our treatment, then we could consider an oral immunosuppressant like methotrexate. That's generally reserved for adults, but it is used in children as well. It just depends on the comfort level of the dermatologist that's treating the child. And in any case, whether it's an adult or a child, it does require very strict supervision by a specialist physician. And so that would be either a dermatologist or a rheumatologist. They would need to be monitoring your blood work every month to make sure that you're tolerating the medication well. As with any treatment, none of these are curative, so they're not cures. So, I think it's very important that you have a discussion with your dermatologist about expectations, because, if something works for you, whether it's the corticosteroid injections or it's the methotrexate, you can't be on these medications forever. In most cases, in some cases, you can be on them for a very long time, but in most cases, you kind of have to decide how long you're willing to take them. And that's, of course, a personal decision that you have to make with your dermatologist. So, if something does work for you, that's great, but you do need to be prepared for the possibility that it won't work forever. And I should also mention that there are other off-label treatments that you could try. I outlined it in an article that I wrote for CANAAF just recently, but there are things like DCP or DPCP, which is a treatment that's applied to the scalp. And the idea behind that is if we can create a minor allergic reaction on the scalp, your immune system will leave the hair follicles alone and it will go after the allergic reaction instead. But it's a very irritating treatment, and it's not well tolerated by many people. And it's also not very easy to access because it has to be delivered in a very controlled setting. So there is that option, but it's not the most accessible option for most people.
Right. I did DPCP for a while when I was younger, and it did work for me for a long time. When I did lose all my hair and then I started wearing wigs, I kind of had to stop the treatment, one, because it stopped working, and two, just because the combination of that and wearing a wig was just so irritating for my scalp. So I think, like you said, it really is what you're prepared to take on, and, being aware of the risks and the challenges that go along with each treatment in order to decide what's best for you. But yeah, there are a number of treatments out there that I feel can be really effective for some people, and it's just making that decision whether to try them.
Yeah, and like I should mention, there are other treatments that I haven't mentioned, and I think, it would take a very long time if I was to sit here and explain all of them. But I think with any treatment, like you said, you have to kind of decide what you're willing to go through and what you're willing to tolerate. And you also have to manage your expectations because, as I said, a treatment might work for you and you may get hair growth, but there may come a time when that treatment stops working and you start losing hair again. And so, I think my recommendation would be for any treatment, you have to go into it being prepared to not know what's going to happen. So don't go into a treatment expecting it to work, but also don't go into a treatment expecting it to not work because, nobody wants to be negative. But just manage your expectations accordingly.
For sure. I think that's excellent advice. And also for anyone, Anthony mentioned that he did write a blog post recently about treatments for alopecia areata. If you're curious and want to learn more about what treatments are out there, you can visit our blog at canaaf.org. And yeah, you can read his full article.
And, Anthony, in talking about expectations, I feel like social media, for example, there's so many ads that I've come across that talk about serums, topical treatments, dietary solutions, and things like that. And they always seem to include like before and after pictures of people's hair growing back, like, success stories. And you know me, I'm very leery of things like that because I feel like it gives people a false sense of hope in some cases. For me, I fell for some of them because I felt so desperate because I didn't know what was going on with my scalp. So how can people discern what will work versus what won't work? Like, I know we talked about expectations, but I feel like the internet is kind of inundated with these quick hair loss solutions for little money, or it's like you have to buy a series of it. And like you said, you have to keep using it in order to maintain the results. Like, how do people discern, what to do in that case? Because I feel like when we do lose our hair, we are in a bit of a desperate situation because we just don't know what's happening, right?
Yeah, I mean, you hit the nail right on the head. I mean, certainly Western medicine doesn't have all of the answers, and it may well be possible that certain, and I'll say this in quotes, natural treatments might work for some people. But I just would like to strongly emphasize that there's very little scientific evidence supporting any, quote unquote, natural serum or supplement. And so in terms of discerning what's fact and what's fiction, I would say if you're looking at something and they're promising full regrowth, going from no hair at all to a full head of hair, it's probably not true because even some of the best medications that we have available right now can't do that. And so it's highly unlikely that whatever this company or a person is offering is going to be able to do that for you. I would also advise, if they're asking you to spend money or you have to sign up to learn more, if they're asking for your credit card information, it's probably fake. My recommendation would be to anyone that is able to understand the literature to do just a quick Google search. Whatever it is that they're proposing and see if any research comes up supporting its use. And, if you're not comfortable doing that or you don't really understand how to look at the research, the best thing you can do is go to your family physician, go to your dermatologist and say, hey, I saw this on Instagram or Facebook or Pinterest. Do you know if this really works? Or come to CANAAF. I'm always happy to answer people's questions. All you have to do is send me an email and say, hey, Anthony, I saw, this treatment, this proposed treatment. Do you think there's any legitimacy to it? Do you think it works? And I'll be able to tell you.
And just to add one more thing, because my brain's always working. Diet. I feel like that's another big thing because like when you're dealing with inflammation, like there are certain foods that may trigger one's inflammation and that sort of thing. So how do you debunk, or can you break down maybe the myths or facts surrounding that, say, for example, if you go gluten and dairy free, that will help reduce the inflammation and maybe stimulate some sort of hair growth?
Yeah. So as far as gluten goes, there isn't really any strong data to suggest that gluten in and of itself causes any inflammation and causes alopecia. But in people who have celiac disease, so who have inflammatory reactions to consuming gluten, cutting it out may cause or may trigger some hair growth. But just generally speaking, as far as we know, there aren't any particular foods or diets that cause alopecia. Some people may have heard of the autoimmune protocol diet, which, some people swear by, and you know what, maybe it works for them. But again, it all comes down to whether or not we have the evidence to support its use. So,
Okay.
I would tell somebody flat out that, there's no harm in trying a diet if you see one to see if it works for you. But I would say if you're not seeing results within, a month or so, it's probably not worth going through whatever restriction it is that you have to do for that diet.
Okay.
Yeah.
So pretty much look for the evidence, do your research, and if you're unsure, ask Anthony or, talk to your doctor and see what they recommend too. Is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yep.
Okay, great. And I also just wanted to add too, sometimes you can be fooled by certain treatments that work for hair loss, but not necessarily alopecia areata. So like, for example, sometimes I have strangers who tell me their hair loss solutions, like, oh, my aunt had hair loss and she rubbed coconut oil all over her head and now her hair's back. And so maybe her aunt had a different form of hair loss and that's why it worked for her. But for something like alopecia areata, like Anthony was saying, there might not be that research behind it to show that it actually works for alopecia areata. So just again, like about guarding your expectations and being careful, about who you trust and what information you trust, because alopecia is already such an emotional ride, and having all these other voices, telling you what to try and what treatments to do can really impact your mental health. So just always be careful and do your research and find a few voices who you trust to listen to.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that because I actually was using coconut oil for the longest time because I was told the same thing, that it was actually their aunt as well, who had alopecia, and she used a whole bunch of coconut oil and it worked for her. So what did I do? I went to Walmart and I bought a huge jar of coconut oil and I was lathering it all over my head for the longest time with no response. And there are many different types of alopecia. I think sometimes people, they use the term alopecia to describe alopecia areata. And, it's important to understand that alopecia, the term, is a medical term for hair loss. It says nothing about the type of hair loss that you have. So, under that umbrella of alopecia, we have androgenetic alopecia, which is one of the more common types that people have. There's alopecia areata, there's CCCA. So whenever someone tells you something worked for their alopecia, it does not mean by any stretch of the imagination that it's going to work for you too.
Yeah, that's such an important distinction. And don't worry, I too went through the coconut oil phase where I bought the jar of coconut, I tried it, and it didn't work for me either.
I'm going to throw a monkey wrench in. Did any of you guys try the egg and mayo? Or am I the only one? I
did not try that.
I didn't do egg and mayo, but I did onion juice.
I did that too. I did that.
And I think my family probably is still angry at me for that because if anybody knows, when you are juicing an onion, the scent goes through the entire house and it makes everybody's eyes water. And so we were all wearing sunglasses while I was juicing it because I was determined to get that onion juice and to get my hair growing back.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
I know exactly what you mean. And you put it in a spray bottle, right?
Yep.
See?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, like the onion juice was very strong. And even the mayo and egg treatment, people were telling me that maybe I just didn't have enough protein. And egg is protein. So mix it with mayo and slather it on my head. Like I was a mess. And I kept doing it because I'm like, okay, protein. But then when you Google and you do a little bit more digging, the molecules in eggs are huge. How is that even penetrating anything?
Yeah. And you know what? That tends to be the difficulty with topical treatments in general is getting it to actually absorb into the skin and get to the hair follicle where we want it to go. There's no legitimacy to any of that.
The things we will do for hair. Am I right, guys?
Yeah.
Right? It's the audacity, right? Can we?
The audacity, yes.
In terms of other treatments that are available, the biggest breakthrough that we've seen right now is with JAK or Janus kinase inhibitors. They were recently approved in the US as the first ever approved treatment for alopecia areata, because up until that point, as I said, every treatment that we were using has been repurposed. And the way that JAK inhibitors work is they inhibit a part of our immune system that's called the JAK-STAT pathway, and that just plays a role in the communication of the immune cells that are causing the attacking.
Okay, so I guess my question would be, how long can someone be on these?
It really depends on the person. So JAK inhibitors are a type of selective immunosuppressant. So that is something that we have to bear in mind when someone is on it. So it really depends on the prescribing physician and how they feel. They'll monitor your blood work. I believe it's every month, at least in the beginning, to see how you're responding to it. So short answer is I don't have a time frame because for everyone it's going to be different. But as far as I know, it could be up to several years.
And are there any potential risks or side effects?
Yeah, so with every medication, every single medication has its own risks. Even the basic Tylenol and Advil that we take when we get a headache has risks. But with respect to JAK inhibitors, because they are a selective immunosuppressant, there is an increased risk of developing infections. And that's just because, as I'm sure everybody knows, our immune systems function to protect us from different pathogens that make us sick, like bacteria, viruses, parasites, things like that. And so if you're suppressing even just a little bit of the immune system, you lose some of that protection potentially. And so that's why there is an increased risk of infections. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention is if you were to look up JAK inhibitors right now, you would likely see that there is a potential increased risk for malignancy or cancer.
Okay.
I should mention that it's a low risk and you're monitored every month by your prescribing physician to see if the risk is increasing. And then if it is, and you can stop the medication and the risk goes away. But the reason why that risk exists is because similar to how the immune system protects us from bacteria and viruses, it also protects us against cancer. And that's something that not a lot of people know.
Okay.
And so, again, if you're losing some of that protection, you are theoretically at an increased risk of developing malignancy. But as I said, your physician will monitor your white blood cell counts very carefully. And if they see that it's starting to go up, they can take you off the medication before anything becomes a problem.
And I guess what would happen if you stopped taking it?
Yeah, so that's something that we don't have a whole lot of scientific evidence on right now.
Okay.
But likely what would happen is the person would lose some of their hair, if not all of the hair that has regrown. And it's unfortunate, but that's just because the drug only works as long as you're taking it. So, it does suppress the autoimmune response, but once you stop taking the drug, you don't have anything to suppress that immune response anymore. And so it has the potential to start firing again and start attacking the hair follicles. So realistically, the person will probably lose some hair, maybe not all of the hair that they regrew, but likely some. But who knows? There is a possibility that, maybe somebody takes it and then they stop taking the medication and they don't lose any of the hair that they regrew.
Is there any idea of when this will be available in Canada? And do you know if it'll be covered by insurance? Because I suspect something like this is probably very expensive if you don't have coverage.
Canada tends to be behind the US in terms of approving drugs. And so that's why we haven't approved it yet. Based on conversations that I've had with dermatologists in Canada and pharmaceutical companies, it will hopefully be approved within the next 6 to 8 months, but that's just an estimate. And so there's really no way to know. The ball is in Health Canada's court and they just have to approve it. And then in terms of insurance companies covering it, right now, they only cover JAK inhibitors for their approved treatments. So once JAK inhibitors like Olumiant, baricitinib, that is the JAK inhibitor that was approved in the US, once that's approved in Canada, then insurance companies will begin to see that there is some legitimacy to this and that it does work and it is worth covering. So it may not happen right after it's approved, but it should happen shortly after. And you did mention that they are likely expensive. They are. And so if somebody wanted to take a JAK inhibitor now for alopecia areata, they would have to pay out of pocket. And they're looking at upwards of $2,000-$3,000 for a month's supply.
For 1 month's supply?
For a 1 month supply.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, come on, Health Canada, get it together.
Yeah, it's very expensive.
Wow. And I'm just curious, is this something that someone with other forms of alopecia could try? Like, so for example, someone like myself who has a form of scarring alopecia.
So it's interesting. For scarring alopecias, there has been some conversation about using JAK inhibitors to treat it, because even though the biology underlying scarring alopecia is a little bit different than alopecia areata, there may be some similarities in terms of the inflammation that happens. And so there was some talk about using JAK inhibitors in the early stages of scarring alopecia. Whether or not that has actually happened, or whether or not there is any success to that, I'm not entirely sure. I would have to go back and look at the literature, but it is a possibility, just because, if the inflammation in scarring alopecia is caused by autoimmunity, then it makes sense that a JAK inhibitor like Olumiant could work. But more research is needed for that. And then in terms of other alopecias, probably not, because JAK inhibitors are meant to treat autoimmune disease.
Okay.
And so if the type of alopecia, such as androgenetic alopecia, which isn't autoimmune in nature, there would be no need for a JAK inhibitor, because it probably wouldn't do anything.
So, Anthony, can you share any projects or things that you've been working on recently, something new and up and coming for our listeners? Like what is next for you? Tell us more about what's on your agenda.
Yeah, so there's quite a bit going on, actually. So anyone who follows CANAAF might be aware that a couple of years ago, I embarked on a research study with a very well-known dermatologist, Dr. Catherine Sibold, and we wanted to investigate the burden of alopecia areata on Canadian patients and caregivers. And that research showed us that, just as we suspected, alopecia areata is significantly burdensome on people, and it causes pervasive anxiety and depression, and many people have adjustment disorder because of it. And so that research was published in the Journal of Medical Internet Research Dermatology. And after that, I embarked on a systematic review with Dr. Sibold again, and we looked at what the research says about different blood tests in people with alopecia, to see what biomarkers are abnormal or are normal. And we found that people with alopecia areata tend to have significantly lower levels of vitamin D and significantly higher levels of two inflammatory biomarkers. One is called C-reactive protein. Another one is called interleukin 6. And so that research is being published in Autoimmunity Reviews, which I'm very excited about, because that is a very prestigious journal, and we almost didn't think we would get it, but we did. So that's exciting. And then in terms of what's next, I'm going to be working with the University of British Columbia to see how alopecia areata impacts people's ability to work and to go to school. And I'm also going to be doing another research project looking at tackling anxiety in youth who have alopecia. And I'm sure I'll be doing more, but that's what I have going on right now.
Wow, booked and busy.
Thank you.
Yeah. So much exciting stuff going on.
Yeah.
It really is phenomenal. And I think all of your accomplishments, Anthony, are so inspiring. Even just the fact that you're such a strong advocate in this space, we're all really so grateful for that. And I guess I want to close by asking you, what would you tell your younger, newly diagnosed self? You know, you look at all the breakthroughs you're making within your medical career today. If you could go back and give yourself a couple words of wisdom, what would you say?
Yeah, I've thought about this because I've been asked this question a few times now, and it's like if you had told me however many years ago when I was first diagnosed that I would be on the board of directors of CANAAF and I would be a researcher and I'd be published and I'd be making these breakthroughs, I wouldn't believe you because I honestly didn't even know if I could survive the alopecia, like as serious as it is. There was a point in time when I didn't want to be alive because my alopecia was causing such significant depression and anxiety. And so, looking back and seeing that I made it through to the other side, so to speak, I think I would just tell myself that, it will get better. It's not going to be like this forever, because I think for me, I really felt like my world was crumbling in front of me and there was nothing that I could do about it. And so I just wish that I could have had someone to tell me that it will get better. You will make it through and you can do whatever it is that you want to do with your life, with or without hair. Alopecia does not have to be the thing that stops you. So that's what I would tell myself.
Why am I crying?
I've cried a lot, so I get it.
Oh my God.
Goodness.
I
That
felt
hit
that.
home, Anthony.
Yeah.
That really
Yeah.
hit home.
I felt that. Especially the part about, you not even wanting to be here.
Yeah.
Like, I'm sure there are people out there that can relate to that statement very strongly. And we really want to strongly stress you are not in this fight alone.
Mm-hmm.
There are organizations out there like CANAAF and NAF and, reach out to a counselor, your friend, someone that you trust, so that you can express these emotions without feeling like you're so isolated and by yourself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I wish that, obviously there's no sense in harping on it now, but I do wish that that I had known about CANAAF before, because while I wasn't alone, I had my family and I had my friends. There's something about being surrounded by people that have the same condition as you, because they just get it. Your family and your friends, they can try their hardest to say the right things to you, but nobody will truly understand what you're going through like someone else that's also going through it. And so, that's why I would highly encourage anyone who's newly diagnosed who maybe doesn't feel ready, per se, to jump into support groups and, share their stories, but just be there to listen. Just be there to be surrounded by people who have alopecia, because the support that you get from that really is life-changing, and it's unlike anything else that you can ever get.
That's a perfect way to put it. Yeah, it really is one step at a time. And Anthony, all the steps that you've made towards helping people be more informed and more empowered, we really do appreciate it. So thank you so much for this conversation, for your openness and sharing all the intel. It's been so wonderful to chat with you.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really been a pleasure to be here today.